The city of Belgorod has been plunged into darkness, and the event marks the most significant strategic shift since the war began. This was not a random attack. It was a deliberate, calculated act of symmetric retaliation, a direct fulfillment of the long-standing Ukrainian promise that the era of Russian impunity is over. For every piece of vital Ukrainian infrastructure that Russia attempts to destroy, a piece of Russian infrastructure will now be eliminated in return. The evidence from the ground is stark and undeniable. Following a protracted Russian drone and missile assault on Ukrainian power plants, a counterstrike successfully targeted key energy facilities in Belgorod. Missiles slammed into the local thermal power plant and the critical Luch electrical substation. The consequences were immediate, visible, and comprehensive. The city was not just darkened, its very function was disrupted. Power was cut across large districts, causing elevators to stall, traffic lights to fail, and businesses to shut down, often accepting cash only in the ensuing chaos. Crucially, the attack also severed the water supply in many areas. This cascading failure, where a power loss instantly translates into a water crisis, is a painful reality that Ukraine's citizens know all too well, but one that is now being experienced on Russian soil. The loss of electricity also crippled emergency systems, with the local governor publicly admitting that the missile warning sirens were compromised. This admission of systemic vulnerability, that the state could no longer guarantee the most basic security warnings, is a massive political blow that proves the terror of the war is no longer a distant abstraction. For months, the Kremlin and its propaganda apparatus dismissed this threat as a bluff. They believed they had established a geopolitical red line, that they could terrorize the Ukrainian civilian population with impunity. They were catastrophically wrong. The strike on Belgorod's tech is a direct, calculated response, establishing the eye for an eye doctrine as the new military reality. This move is politically and strategically brilliant. It forces the Russian military command to make a brutal recalculation. Their entire war logic was predicated on the belief that they could inflict maximum pain while maintaining a zone of complete safety for their own critical infrastructure. That zone of safety no longer exists. This strategic development is a direct consequence of the political shift in the West. As we have seen, the current administration has signaled a clear willingness to support a more aggressive defense by Ukraine. This has eliminated the tied hands policy that previously protected Russian energy sites. Now, Ukraine has the political and technical authority to answer aggression with aggression. This symmetrical warfare immediately ratchets up the cost and the risk for Moscow, placing immense internal pressure on a regime that is already struggling with a severe economic crisis and a failing military campaign. The blackout in Belgorod is not the end of the war, but it is the definitive signal that the rules of engagement have changed forever. We've dissected the successful strike on Belgorod, but to understand its true significance, we must now move to the decision room in Washington. The symmetric retaliation that plunged a Russian city into darkness was not simply a tactical victory, it was the direct, inevitable consequence of a massive political shift within the American administration. For over 2 years, Ukraine fought with one hand tied behind its back. That era is definitively over. The paradox of the war has been the strict limitations imposed by the United States on the use of its weaponry. Ukraine was armed with precision, long-range systems, but was forbidden from using them to strike targets on Russian soil. This created a strategic safe haven for Russia, a no-strike zone that allowed it to launch attacks from military installations and energy hubs with near-total impunity. This policy, designed to prevent escalation, achieved the exact opposite. It prolonged the war and emboldened the aggressor. But that period of paralysis has now ended. The signals from Washington have shifted from hesitant caution to strategic resolve. The most damning evidence of this change came from figures who were previously known for their skepticism about Ukraine aid. J.D. Vance, the powerful vice president, explicitly admitted that Russia is the party sabotaging peace talks, a complete reversal of the political narrative that the Kremlin had worked so hard to cultivate. This public acknowledgement of Russia's belligerence was the necessary political cover for the military change. The true significance of this shift was then confirmed by General Kit Kellogg, who stated the new operational doctrine. The US has granted the political authorization for Ukraine to use American weapons for deep strikes against military targets inside Russia. His words were unequivocal: unrestricted zones no longer exist. This is the definitive political statement that has erased Russia's strategic sanctuary. The calculus has moved from how do we avoid escalation to how do we win this war by imposing reciprocal costs. The material consequences of this political pivot are already massive. The potential transfer of high-value, long-range assets is now on the table. The Tomahawk cruise missile, a weapon with immense precision and range, is openly being discussed. This is not a drill, it's a direct response to Russia's missile terror and a strategic escalation that Moscow never anticipated. Furthermore, the massive proposed $90 billion arms deal and the agreement on drone manufacturing with Ukraine signify a profound long-term commitment. This partnership is no longer about stopgap aid. It is about permanently building up Ukraine's military-industrial complex and providing it with the offensive capability to end the war on its own terms. The political shift in Washington has been the most important strategic development of the year. It has provided Ukraine with the political and military freedom to fight a war of reciprocal action. The message to the Kremlin is now clear. For every attack on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, there will be a symmetric, strategic response on Russian soil. The era of Russia's impunity is over, and the political decision to end that impunity is the biggest threat the Kremlin has faced yet.
We've dissected the political shift in Washington, but the most crucial consequence of the Belgorod strike was its devastating psychological and military impact on the Russian establishment. This single counterattack caused a massive shockwave, instantly shattering the Kremlin's core lie that its own vital energy infrastructure was untouchable. The reaction from the military establishment, particularly the Z bloggers and field commanders, was not defiance. It was a loud, desperate confession of systemic failure. The core of the shock lies in the sudden exposure of a massive strategic vulnerability. For years, the Russian high command operated under the absolute assumption that their energy grid was immune to attack. Their entire air defense strategy was based on two priorities: protecting the frontline troops and defending key military assets like air bases and missile launch sites. This left the soft underbelly of critical civilian infrastructure, the power plants and substations, dangerously undefended. The successful strike on the Belgorod tech proved that this doctrine was catastrophically flawed. The cascading failure, which knocked out power and water across a regional capital, showed that the elaborate, layered Russian air defense system, the S-300s and S-400s, is irrelevant when the threat is a simple, precise missile strike on a high-value civilian target far from the front. The ensuing internal criticism was a more damaging blow to the regime than the physical damage itself. The Z bloggers were in a fury, publicly questioning the competence of the high command. Their outrage focused on the absurdity of the situation. Why was our power plant undefended? Why are we firing multi-million-dollar missiles at Ukraine while a regional capital is in darkness? This internal revolt of the pro-war community is a crucial confession of impotence. They openly acknowledged that the Russian air defense system is still designed to fight a war that is no longer being fought. It is too slow, too rigid, and too poorly positioned to counter a low-altitude, precise missile strike targeting a static, civilian target hundreds of miles behind the front. This strategic exposure forces a critical decision on the Russian leadership. They must now divert scarce air defense assets away from military sites and place them over civilian energy infrastructure. This creates a no-win scenario. They are now compelled to choose between defending their military assets, the missile depots and command posts, and defending their civilian grids. This pressure is the direct, intended goal of the symmetric retaliation. By forcing Russia to scatter its defense, Ukraine makes future strikes on both military and economic targets far easier to execute. The ultimate cost of the terror campaign has now been imposed on the aggressor, proving that the price of aggression now applies to both sides.
We have analyzed the political permission and the tactical strike on Belgorod.
Now we must turn to the ultimate strategic objective, the threat of a systemic, multi-regional collapse of Russia's energy grid. The strike on the Belgorod power plant was merely a proof of concept. The true, terrifying goal of this counter-campaign is to bring the cost of the war to an existential level by targeting the single most critical, unreplaceable component of the entire Russian power system. That component is the Large Power Transformer, or LPT. This is the Achilles heel of Russia's vast energy infrastructure. To understand why, you must understand its role. An LPT is a colossal piece of equipment weighing upwards of 300 tons and costing tens of millions of dollars. It is the gatekeeper of the power grid, responsible for stepping up the voltage to immense levels so electricity can travel over thousands of kilometers of power lines across Russia's immense territory. Without LPTs, power cannot be transmitted over long distances, and the entire grid fractures. The vulnerability is now quantifiable and terrifying. As military energy analysts have pointed out, the Russian power system is highly dependent on a limited number of these key transformers. Due to decades of poor maintenance, systemic corruption, and the crippling effect of international sanctions, Russia has almost no capacity to quickly replace these units. An LPT takes well over a year to manufacture under normal circumstances, and acquiring the necessary specialized components is now practically impossible under sanctions. This creates a critical weakness that Ukraine is strategically exploiting. This brings us to the scenario of cascading collapse. Expert analysis has determined that destroying a mere 70 of these critical LPTs would be enough to cause a multi-regional systemic failure. This is not about a temporary blackout in one city. It's about plunging vast industrialized sections of the country into darkness. The consequence would be total. Factories would stop, rail traffic would halt, heating systems would fail in the depth of winter, and command and control would be paralyzed. The vastness of Russia, which the Kremlin relies on as a strategic shield, suddenly becomes its greatest liability, as it cannot transmit power across its own territory. The threat of the Tomahawk missile directly relates to this vulnerability. The potential transfer of these long-range, highly precise cruise missiles gives Ukraine the perfect tool to execute this strategic plan. Unlike less accurate, improvised drones, a Tomahawk has the precision to hit the designated 70 LPTs deep within Russian territory. The strategic calculus for the Kremlin is now agonizing. Continue the terror campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure and guarantee that Ukraine will use Western-style cruise missiles to dismantle Russia's energy grid, risking a complete economic and social collapse. This strategy is not a matter of military bravado. It is a cold, calculated move to impose reciprocal costs. The successful strike on Belgorod was the warning. The threat of the LPT collapse is the ultimate pressure point, raising the cost of the war to an unbearable existential level. The panic in the Kremlin is justified because the threat is no longer theoretical. It is a strategic certainty that only their immediate cessation of aggression can prevent. Russia is now facing a system failure designed to force a political surrender.
We have meticulously chronicled the tactical success of the Belgorod strike, the shocking political enablement from the United States, and the existential threat posed by Russia's vulnerable energy grid. Now, we turn to the final, unavoidable conclusion. The war has fundamentally changed, and Russia has been forced into a phase of reciprocal action that it cannot win. The final verdict on this conflict will be dictated not by the progress of troops on the front line, but by the relentless, devastating logic of retaliation. The core of this new reality is simple. The era of Russian impunity is definitively over. For too long, the Kremlin's war strategy was based on an assumption of safety, the belief that they could inflict terror on the Ukrainian civilian population by destroying power plants and water supplies, while their own infrastructure remained untouchable. The strike on Belgorod was the moment that illusion died. It was the fulfillment of a promise, the declaration that the eye for an eye doctrine is now the official policy of the Ukrainian defense. This is not aggression.
This is a logical, necessary response to a campaign of terror that has been ongoing since 2022. The cost of terror now applies to both sides. This new military reality is inextricably linked to the political decision-making in Washington. The public commitment from key U.S. officials confirming that unrestricted zones no longer exist is the strategic linchpin that makes this entire campaign possible. This political shift, born out of a realization that prolonged hesitation only emboldens the aggressor, has granted Ukraine the freedom to strike at the sources of Russian aggression. The Kremlin can no longer hide its most critical military and economic infrastructure behind a diplomatic shield. The choice is now agonizingly clear: stop the aggression or face a constant, paralyzing assault on the very systems that sustain your war effort and your civilian life. This brings us to the ultimate existential threat: the cascading collapse of the Russian energy system. The Belgorod strike was merely a warning shot, a calibration for a much larger, more devastating plan. The strategic goal is to present the Kremlin with a clear choice: stop the war on acceptable terms or face a systemic, self-inflicted collapse of its own power grid. By targeting the large power transformers, LPTs, the irreplaceable, massive components of the Russian grid, Ukraine is targeting the nation's most critical structural vulnerability. The expert consensus is damning. The destruction of just 70 LPTs would plunge massive sections of Russia into darkness and cripple its industrial base. This is a weapon of deterrence, a signal that the cost of continuing the war has been raised to an unbearable existential level. The final verdict is that the war will end, and it will end on Ukraine's terms. This outcome is assured not because Ukraine will conquer Moscow, but because Russia cannot afford the reciprocal costs. The war has become a financial, logistical, and political black hole for the Kremlin, and its failure to adapt has been met with a devastating counter-strategy. The logic of retaliation is a simple, brutal law of physics. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Russia's aggression has now triggered that reaction, and the momentum has shifted irrevocably. The war is moving toward an end dictated by the new, painful reality that the security of Russia's infrastructure now depends entirely on the restraint of its own military. This brings us to the ultimate existential threat: the cascading collapse of the Russian energy system. The Belgorod strike was merely a warning shot, a calibration for a much larger, more devastating plan. The strategic goal is to present the Kremlin with a clear choice: stop the war on acceptable terms or face a systemic, self-inflicted collapse of its own power grid. By targeting the large power transformers, LPTs, the irreplaceable, massive components of the Russian grid, Ukraine is targeting the nation's most critical structural vulnerability. The expert consensus is damning. The destruction of just 70 LPTs would plunge massive sections of Russia into darkness and cripple its industrial base. This is a weapon of deterrence, a signal that the cost of continuing the war has been raised to an unbearable existential level. The final verdict is that the war will end, and it will end on Ukraine's terms. This outcome is assured not because Ukraine will conquer Moscow, but because Russia cannot afford the reciprocal costs. The war has become a financial, logistical, and political black hole for the Kremlin, and its failure to adapt has been met with a devastating counter-strategy. The logic of retaliation is a simple, brutal law of physics. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Russia's aggression has now triggered that reaction, and the momentum has shifted irrevocably. The war is moving toward an end dictated by the new, painful reality that the security of Russia's infrastructure now depends entirely on the restraint of its own military.